all love to get creative with our embossing powders. They add such a fantastic added bonus to your cards. But today I'm showing you how to step up your heat embossing with some impression stamping. This is such a fun technique. You can use any embossing powders that you have and combine it with any stamp sets you've got. So grab your stamps, your powders, and let's get creating. Hey, it's Verity here from the Wow Creative team, and welcome to the Wow Embossing Powder YouTube channel. So to begin with, what we need to do is create heat embossed background panels. You can trim these down later on to any size you want, but I'm just using an A2 size card panel here. I've got my Wow Embossing Clear Ultra Slow Drying Embossing ink here, and I'm just smooshing this down onto my card panel. This is to ensure that my card gets a good coverage of ink. You want the card to be covered in as much ink as possible to get a lovely, smooth, embossed background. Once you've done this, you can then cover it with embossing powder. So for this first card, I am using the Alexandra Renke's Judith Blush Embossing Powder in collaboration with WowEmbossingPowder. It is a beautiful pink. It is a translucent powder, so do bear this in mind depending on what cardstock you overlay this. So as I'm using it with white, it will give a lovely soft pink. A darker card or a different colour card might give it a different colour tinge to it. Once I've covered the panel in embossing powder and tapped off any excess, I'm then using my heat embossing tool just to heat set the panel. Now, when I finished creating these, I did realise that I should have used a heavier weight cardstock. There is going to be a lot of heat directed to that card panel. The thicker your card is, the less it will warp. However, I worked around this and it just shows that you can work with some of your errors. Once I'd had heat embossed the whole background, I then went on and repeated this 5 times. So you need about 5 layers of embossing powder before you go on to the impression stamping. Now, whilst I was doing one of my layers, I had a bit of an accident. I smushed my ink pad down a little bit too quickly before it had completely cooled and smudged it. So that's why there's a big, lovely ring there. However, I thought I'm going to stick with it and I'm going to show you that you can still create cards with your mistakes. I'm using quite a textured background and I think this will work well with the effect of that smudge. It adds a little bit more texture. So for this technique, you do need a stamping platform to ensure that you get impression stamping because you need to repeatedly stamp over the same point several times. So I'm using my misti here, and because I'm using a red rubber stamp, I've removed my foam pad. Now, we are going to add some heat to that embossed panel. Don't worry, this doesn't really affect your misti. If you've got any concerns, then perhaps you might want to avoid this technique. What you need to do is you need to heat the panel so that the embossing powder is warm and melted again. What I suggest is that you heat small areas at a time. Then once you heat it, you need to quickly close the door and press your stamp down into the embossing powder. Because it's warm and melted, your stamp will then press into that. Now you don't need to worry, your stamp is not going to get stuck in that embossing powder, it easily releases. So what I'm doing is I'm just working my way up the card panel, heating a small area, closing my misti door, applying quite a bit of pressure and stamping down. And this transfers that stamped image into the embossed panel and you get a beautiful texture. So this is quite a scripty kind of background stamp. And as I say, it's the love note background from Catherine Pooler, and I thought, well, the love note and the script, it's a little bit shabby, it's a little bit textured, and I thought it wouldn't look too bad with that mistake that I created with the embossing powder. So I used this background panel to create 2 cards. I die cut the Pink Fresh Studios Simply Diamonds cover plate out of this, and used both the negative and the positive die cut, adhering them to the card. I also used the Pink Fresh Studio Happy Birthday Sentiment Sweets die set to finish this card off with a little stamped sentiment. So for the next card, I'm going to show you how you can do this with your small acrylic stamps as well. It doesn't have to be just red rubber stamps. You will want to remove the foam pad when you come to heat it, but initially you need to line your stamps up. So I'm just putting a piece of card down because my cardstock had warped quite a bit. I'm just using a card panel to temporarily position where I want my stamps. I'm then going to remove my foam pad and then I'm going to position my card panel in there. Now obviously there is this height difference between the acrylic and the red rubber stamps. So I'm adding some scrap cardstock panels into the misti just to lift up and provide that height that the card panel needs to be in order for those stamps later to impress into the heat embossing. For this card, I did create a background panel using In The Navy embossing ink. So again, I did exactly the same method to begin with. I'm not going to show you that again, but I did about 5 layers of embossing powder. And I also, at this point, hadn't twigged on to use a thicker piece of card. So I'm using some temporary adhesive just to keep that in place. And then I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm only really applying the heat though to the area of the card panel that I'm stamping in. It's going to be in the centre, so I don't need to heat all of that panel. And I'm just making sure it's nice and warm, nice and hot and melted, so that when I close my misti door, I can press down and impress these stamps into the card. Now these hearts come from the Wow Embossing Powder Layered Hearts stamp set. It has so many hearts in there. There is a heart for anybody, whether you like a bold one, an outlined one, or a patterned one. They've also got different sizes. Now I've created this impression, but I wanted to add a little bit more interest to it. So what I did was I took a few of these smaller hearts from the stamp set, positioned them over the top, and then I'm going to stamp those down into it with some embossing ink. So I'm not heat setting this time. All I'm doing is I'm adding ink to the little hearts, and then I'm closing my door to transfer the ink. I'm then covering this with rose gold embossing powder, and I'm heat setting. Now you do want to ensure that your heat gun is quite hot at this point before you bring it to the card panel to melt that embossing powder. This is because you don't really want to melt too much of the surrounding powder where you've created that impression, because you don't want it to sink and merge back into a flat panel. You want to work quite quickly. I finished this off by just trimming the panel down, adding it to a white card panel, and then adding a stamped sentiment from the Wow Embossing Powder Round and Round stamp set. So for this last card panel, I have used the embossing powder oiled slate, and I have again created a card panel with about 5 layers of embossing powder, and then I am just heat setting that card panel, again pressing my stamp down into that embossing powder. I'm just working my way up the panel. This background stamp is the painted striped stamp from Catherine Pooler. I thought this gave a lovely texture to this panel that worked really well with that colour of embossing powder. Now as I say, you are applying heat to your stamping platform, but you're only applying it in short bursts, so it doesn't really cause any problem to your misti, but that is a risk that you need to take whether you want to do that or not. Once that background was complete, I used a square die to cut out a panel, and I foam mounted this onto the card, and then I used a Hello Word die from Catherine Pooler and the Blossom stamp set from Altenew to finish this card off. For full details of all of the products used in today's video, they are listed down in the description box or over on the blog. If you're new here, why not think about subscribing? And if you want to check out my own personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I'll include a link here as well as down below. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and you found a new technique to you. Impression stamping with heat embossing is a really great way to step up your backgrounds. Until next time, happy crafting!